The day the empath stops caring. There comes a profoundly significant moment in the journey of every deeply sensitive empath when an inexplicable shift occurs within their being. Something fundamental inside them goes completely silent, not in a way that suggests breakage or anger, but rather a profound sense of being done. Carl Jung, the eminent psychologist, meticulously studied this phenomenon, recognizing it as far more than mere depression or simple emotional exhaustion. He meticulously termed it the final stage of spiritual awakening, a transformation so potent it often leaves those who witness it utterly terrified. This fear stems from a stark truth. When an empath ceases to care in the way they once did, they do not devolve into cruelty. Instead, they become truly untouchable, and this profound shift irrevocably alters everything in their world and the worlds they inhabit. Jung dedicated decades of his groundbreaking work to understanding individuals who arrived at this extraordinary state. His findings challenged virtually every conventional belief about empathy, spirituality, and the very essence of personal transformation. The moment an empath stops caring is not in fact a culmination of their journey. It is merely the dramatic prelude to something far more powerful, far more authentic, and deeply resonant. Before we can fully grasp the profound reasons why empaths ultimately reach a point where they cease to care, we must first deeply comprehend the relentless pressures and subtle forces that gradually push them towards this precipice. Jung meticulously documented a remarkably consistent pattern across the spectrum of his most highly sensitive patients. These were not merely individuals who occasionally felt emotions with a certain depth. Rather, they were beings whose entire nervous system functioned as an intricate, hyper-attuned emotional receiver, constantly scanning and absorbing the emotional frequencies of everyone in their immediate vicinity. They would simply walk into a room and instantly, almost involuntarily, absorb the psychological atmosphere, picking up on every unspoken tension, every subtle undercurrent. Family dinners, for instance, would leave them utterly depleted, their energy exhausted from the arduous task of silently managing everyone's suppressed anxieties and simmering resentments. Friendships, though cherished, often drained them dry because they found themselves unconsciously carrying the emotional weight of both sides of every conflict, mediating unspoken battles. Romantic relationships often bordered on destructive, not because of malicious intent, but because the empath would feel their partner's pain, their partner's insecurities, their partner's joys, and their partner's sorrows, with an intensity that often surpassed even the partner's own experience. Jung astutely labeled these remarkable individuals the emotional shock absorbers of their intricate social systems. They didn't merely empathize with suffering, they absorbed it, internalized it, meticulously processed it, and somehow, through an almost alchemical process, transmuted it so that others around them could continue to function, often blissfully unaware of the immense energetic cost. Parents would routinely offload their anxieties, their fears, and their stresses onto them. Siblings without conscious malice would treat them as readily available, free of charge therapists. Partners, often unknowingly, would treat them like ever-present emotional support animals, whose sole purpose, it seemed, was to meticulously manage their moods and regulate their emotional states. And here lies the particularly disturbing essence of Jung's profound observations. These empaths rarely, if ever, voiced a complaint. They accepted this incredibly demanding role as if it were their inherent purpose, their sacred duty. They genuinely believed that their unique sensitivity was intrinsically meant to serve others, that their extraordinary gift intrinsically obligated them to sacrifice their own inner peace, their own well-being, for the comfort and stability of everyone else. They wore their profound exhaustion not as a burden but as a silent badge of honor, a testament in their own minds to their goodness, to their deep capacity to care enough to suffer endlessly for others. This pervasive cultural conditioning ran astonishingly deep, embedding itself from their earliest childhood. They had been consistently praised for their understanding nature, for their ability to make others feel better, for their unwavering dedication to maintaining peace and harmony at any cost. Every single time they suppressed their own genuine needs, their own heartfelt desires, to accommodate someone else's agenda, they received a powerful rush of external validation. Every instance where they absorbed another person's explosive anger to avert a conflict, they were commendably told they were mature far beyond their tender years. This relentless stream of positive reinforcement inadvertently forged a deeply ingrained pattern of profound self-abandonment, a pattern that tragically felt indistinguishable from genuine virtue. Yet Jung, with his piercing insight, discerned something critical that the empaths themselves, caught in the web of their own conditioning, were not yet able to perceive. Beneath their outwardly compassionate facade, their profound and complex psyche was meticulously keeping records. Every subtle manipulation, every unspoken betrayal, every single instance where someone took undue advantage of their boundless kindness and generous spirit, all of it was logged. The empath's unconscious mind was not merely passively absorbing these myriad experiences in a random, haphazard fashion. On the contrary, it was diligently cataloguing these intricate patterns with an almost surgical precision, building an internal database of human behavior and its myriad complexities. Consider, for example, an individual who had dedicated 15 years of their life to tirelessly managing their family's often chaotic dysfunction. They possessed an uncanny, almost encyclopedic knowledge of precisely which words would invariably trigger their mother's notorious guilt trips. They understood the exact, predictable emotional sequence their father habitually employed, skillfully evade all forms of accountability. They could anticipate with startling accuracy when their siblings would artfully manufacture crises solely to regain fleeting attention. They had, in essence, mapped every intricate psychological game being played out around them, charting this familiar, often treacherous territory with the precision and meticulousness of a seasoned cartographer. But here lies the truly remarkable observation Jung made. Despite possessing this profound and often unsettling knowledge, these empaths never, not once, weaponized it. They never used their insight to gain an advantage, to strike back, or to protect themselves proactively. Instead, they simply continued to absorb, continued to care, continued to give of themselves relentlessly, until something fundamental, something core within their very being, began to crack under the immense, unyielding pressure. Their conscious awareness had over time become a detailed, living archive of everyone else's complex patterns, while their own deeply held needs, their own genuine desires, remained tragically buried beneath countless layers of selfless service and profound personal sacrifice. This dangerous psychological split, as Jung accurately identified it, created an insidious internal conflict. On the surface, the empath appeared entirely functional, even outwardly thriving in their carefully constructed role as the eternal caretaker. But beneath that meticulously maintained surface, a profound sense of unconscious resentment was steadily accumulating, much like immense pressure building inexorably in a sealed, unvented container. This was not the conscious resentment that could be openly expressed, honestly discussed, and healthily released. No, this was a far more insidious, unconscious resentment that slowly but surely poisoned their very sense of self-worth, eroding their inner peace from within. The inevitable breaking point, Jung observed, almost invariably emerged from a profound act of betrayal. Not a simple disappointment, not a minor disagreement, but a deep, scarring betrayal from someone whom the empath had tirelessly protected, fiercely defended, and loved unconditionally, often for years or even decades. Jung meticulously documented this pivotal trigger point across dozens of his clinical cases, identifying it as the powerful catalyst that inexorably forces what he termed shadow integration. The narrative of this betrayal repeats itself with a disturbing, almost haunting consistency. Someone discovers their partner's long-standing infidelity after years of tirelessly managing that partner's chronic emotional instability, pervasive depression, and debilitating anxiety. An adult child learns that their parent has been speaking cruelly and disparagingly about them behind their back, after decades of selflessly serving as the essential emotional glue that held the entire family system together. A trusted friend unearths devastating lies after years of dutifully carrying secrets and providing unwavering, unconditional support. What rendered these betrayals so utterly destructive was not merely the act of betrayal itself. It was the empath's sudden, jarring recognition that they had, in fact, seen the glaring warning signs all along. Their innate intuition, that quiet inner voice, had been screaming the unvarnished truth for months, even for years. But they had, tragically, silenced it. They had consciously chosen to believe the very best in someone who was, through their actions, showing them precisely who they truly were. In a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to maintain their cherished fantasy of who others could become, they had, in essence, betrayed themselves. This act of self-betrayal, the realization of their own complicity, cut far deeper than the external betrayal perpetrated by another. The empath profoundly realized that they had actively participated in their own exploitation. They had systematically ignored their powerful inner voice, dismissed their visceral gut feelings, and relentlessly overridden their own personal boundaries, all in a desperate effort to maintain relationships that were, quite literally, destroying them from the inside out. The potent anger they now felt was not solely directed towards the betrayer. It was intensely directed towards themselves, for allowing this destructive pattern to continue long after their deepest knowing had warned them against it. That shattering realization broke something fundamental within them. Not their heart, which remained intact despite the pain, but their entire edifice of illusions, their carefully constructed fantasies about others and themselves. Jung termed this pivotal moment the withdrawal of projections. The empath had for so long been projecting their own inherent goodness, their own vast potential, and their own belief in innocence onto people who, in harsh reality, simply did not possess these qualities. They had been seeing not who people truly were, but rather who the empath desperately, ardently wanted them to be. When these powerful, long-held projections finally and irrevocably collapsed, the empath did not, as everyone around them might have expected, cry out, rage uncontrollably, or fall apart in a dramatic display of anguish. Instead, something far more unsettling, far more terrifying in its quiet intensity occurred. They became profoundly quiet, unnaturally calm. Their eyes underwent a subtle but unmistakable change, not brimming with tears but imbued with an astonishing, almost frightening clarity. The pervasive fog that had long obscured their vision finally lifted, and for the very first time in their lives, they perceived reality in its raw, unfiltered truth, devoid of the distorting lens of their desperate, often self-sacrificing hope. If this message deeply resonates with your own experience, please like the video and leave a comment stating, "I am done." Jung himself described this exact moment as one of the most chillingly profound psychological transformations he had ever had the privilege, or perhaps the burden, of witnessing in his extensive clinical practice. The empath in this awakened state simply ceased performing emotional labor. They stopped meticulously managing other people's tumultuous feelings. They stopped laboriously explaining their own needs, justifying their own choices, needlessly apologizing for their very existence. They did not dramatically announce these seismic changes, nor did they make grand, sweeping declarations. They simply quietly and firmly stopped participating in the dysfunctional systems that they had for so long been almost single-handedly holding together. Family members who had implicitly relied upon them to mediate every conflict and smooth over every disagreement suddenly found themselves confronted with the uncomfortable necessity of facing each other directly, without the empath as an intermediary. Partners who had habitually used them as convenient emotional crutches discovered, to their dismay, that they could no longer provoke the familiar, predictable reactions they had come to expect. Friends who had unthinkingly treated them as readily available, free therapists encountered firm, unwavering boundaries where boundless availability had once been the norm. The empath had consciously and decisively withdrawn their vital energy from the intricate emotional economy that had, for so long, depended entirely upon their unwitting exploitation. And here lies what made this profound transformation so profoundly disturbing to those around them. The empath was not angry. Anger, however potent, would have been a familiar emotion, something manageable, something others believed they could either work with or cunningly manipulate. They knew precisely how to navigate an empath's anger because historically, it always eventually dissolved back into a familiar pattern of forgiveness and a resumption of selfless caretaking. But this was not anger. This was an entirely different, far more unsettling phenomenon, a complete, unwavering indifference to the emotional games, the subtle manipulations, and the incessant dramas that had once held them captive and thoroughly controlled them. People in their orbit desperately tried everything in their repertoire to provoke the old, predictable responses. They manufactured elaborate crises. They played the victim with theatrical skill. They employed guilt trips and manipulative tactics. But nothing, absolutely nothing, worked. The empath had effectively unplugged themselves from the complex emotional matrix that had once dictated their every move and response. They now observed these desperate attempts with a detached, almost scientific curiosity, much like a seasoned scientist calmly observing predictable, repetitive behavior within a controlled laboratory setting. Jung precisely identified this monumental shift as the true integration of the shadow. Every empath, he posited, carries within them a powerful shadow self, a part of their identity that society, upbringing and conditioning had relentlessly taught them to deny, to suppress, to be ashamed of. This was the part of them that was inherently selfish, the part that dared to prioritize its own legitimate needs, the part that resolutely refused to save people from the inevitable consequences of their own choices. Society had cunningly convinced them that this shadow was inherently evil, something to be valiantly suppressed and ultimately overcome. Religious teachings often reinforced the idea that selflessness was the ultimate virtue, while cultural narratives relentlessly praised endless sacrifice as the pinnacle of human goodness. Family systems, often unconsciously, rewarded their self-abandonment with praise and acceptance. But Jung, with his profound understanding of the human psyche, recognized that this shadow was not in essence evil. On the contrary, it was the empath's primal survival instinct. It was their innate psychological immune system, diligently striving to protect them from being utterly consumed and overwhelmed by the relentless dysfunction of others. When the profound betrayal finally, irrevocably forced them to confront and integrate this long-denied shadow, they did not, as many might fear, become cruel or vindictive. Instead, they became something far more profound. They became complete. The selfish shadow, that instinct for self-preservation, finally merged harmoniously with the compassionate light, the innate capacity for deep feeling, creating a new, integrated being that society had never truly prepared for. This was an empath who could still feel everything with profound depth, but who now chose with conscious intention precisely where to direct that powerful feeling. An empath who saw through every subtle manipulation with crystal clarity, but no longer felt the oppressive obligation to pretend they didn't. An empath who loved deeply and authentically, but only those individuals who had genuinely earned access to that precious love through consistent reciprocity, mutual respect, and genuine appreciation. This, then, is what Jung truly meant by the final stage of spiritual awakening. It was not about transcending the ego entirely, but rather about the profound and holistic integration of all aspects of the self into a state of conscious, deliberate choice. The empath had, for their entire life, tirelessly cared for others, often at their own immense personal expense. Now, in this awakened state, they were finally learning the art of caring for themselves with the very same fierce intensity, the same unwavering devotion that they had once so freely and indiscriminately given away to everyone else. This was not selfishness in the trivial sense. This was profound self-preservation. their inherent worth finally being honored and treated as truly sacred. The shift in their energetic presence was both immediate and utterly unmistakable. Where the empath had once radiated warmth indiscriminately, showering it upon anyone who happened to be nearby, they now emanated something far more selective, more discerning. Not coldness, which implies a lack of feeling, but a profound, centered consciousness. They no longer leaked their vital emotional energy to anyone who simply demanded it, or who unconsciously siphoned it away. Their presence felt palpably different, deeply grounded, undeniably centered, almost impenetrable in its quiet strength. They had, in Jung's eloquent words, become selectively empathetic. This newfound selectivity, this conscious application of their empathy, was perceived by some as healthy boundaries, a sign of maturity. But to others, those who had previously benefited from the empath's limitless giving, it was often perceived as coldness, even outright cruelty. The empath, for instance, stopped immediately responding to manipulative texts. They allowed phone calls from insistent energy vampires to automatically go to voicemail, no longer feeling compelled to answer every summons. They learned to confidently say no to requests that once would have instantly guilt-tripped them into an automatic yes. They ceased attending family gatherings that invariably left them emotionally devastated and utterly depleted. They decisively ended friendships that had always been glaringly one-sided, a constant drain on their resources. They began, with quiet resolve, to walk away from people they had spent countless years desperately trying to save, trying to fix. But here is the crucial insight that outside observers, trapped in their own limited perspectives, consistently missed. The empath had not, in truth, stopped caring about these people as human beings. What they had stopped caring about was the unsustainable effort of maintaining relationships that relentlessly demanded they betray their own authentic selves. They had stopped caring about being liked or approved of by people who had never truly valued them for who they were, but rather for what they could provide. They had stopped caring about maintaining a superficial, fragile peace in dysfunctional systems that were fundamentally built upon their silent, often agonizing suffering. The empath had, at long last, truly grasped a profound truth that Jung himself had tirelessly strived to teach for decades. You simply cannot genuinely love others well, effectively, and sustainably until you first learn to love yourself with equal depth and devotion. And this was not the shallow, superficial self-love often associated with narcissism, but rather a deep, unshakable self-respect that steadfastly refused to participate in one's own gradual destruction. This fundamental foundation, this unwavering self-respect, was precisely what had always been tragically missing from their past relationships. In the professional realm, this profound transformation manifested as a firm establishment of professional boundaries that often genuinely shocked their colleagues. The individual who had previously absorbed everyone's stress, silently managed every office drama, and seamlessly covered for others, simply stopped performing these unassigned duties. They continued to complete their own work with exemplary excellence, but they no longer automatically took on the responsibilities of others. They attended meetings, but no longer felt compelled to smooth over conflicts that were not, fundamentally, theirs to fix or mediate. They remained pleasant and courteous, but became utterly impenetrable to the subtle emotional manipulations that had once so easily derailed them and siphoned their energy. Managers who had long relied on them to, in essence, do three people's jobs, suddenly found themselves facing someone who meticulously worked their contracted hours, and not a minute more. Co-workers who had routinely dumped their personal problems onto them now encountered polite, yet firm, redirection to appropriate resources, such as HR or professional counseling. The entire office dynamic irrevocably shifted because the empath had consciously removed themselves from the thankless, exhausting role of the universal emotional dumping ground. In the intricate tapestry of family systems, these changes were often even more dramatic and unsettling. The empath, who had historically hosted every holiday, meticulously mediated every bitter family feud, and tirelessly absorbed everyone's cascading dysfunction, simply ceased performing these emotionally taxing functions. This cessation occurred not with loud announcements or confrontational scenes, but rather with a quiet, unwavering unavailability for the burdensome roles they had been unconsciously assigned since their earliest childhood. Parents who had treated them as an ever-present emotional support system suddenly encountered firm, unyielding boundaries. Siblings who had unthinkingly exploited their boundless generosity now faced clear, unmistakable limits. Extended family members who had long taken them completely for granted were now confronted with a version of the empath they simply did not recognize. This was someone who smiled politely, but no longer engaged with or absorbed the family drama. Someone who offered love and connection from a healthy distance, rather than drowning in suffocating proximity. Someone who could calmly and confidently say, "That doesn't work for me," without feeling the slightest need for elaborate explanation or heartfelt apology. The family, predictably, often responded with a mixture of shock, confusion, and indignant accusations. "How could you be so selfish?" they would demand. "What on earth happened to you? You've completely changed." And the empath, now possessing an inner calm and unwavering clarity, would simply nod. Because yes, they had indeed changed. They had finally and definitively stopped setting themselves on fire, extinguishing their own light, in a futile and ultimately self-destructive attempt to keep everyone else warm. The most profound and transformative shift, however, unfolded within their romantic relationships. Empaths who reached this advanced stage of awakening either completely transformed their existing partnerships into something healthier and more equitable, or they ended them, often without the agonizing, prolonged pain and emotional turmoil that had characterized their past breakups. Partners who had grown accustomed to the empath's endless wellspring of forgiveness suddenly found themselves facing real, undeniable accountability for their actions. Behaviors that had been tolerated, even quietly enabled for years, were now unequivocally deemed unacceptable. The empath stopped exhaustively explaining why certain things hurt them. Instead, they simply, calmly removed themselves from situations and dynamics that violated their newly cherished inner peace. Some partners, observing this monumental shift, bravely rose to meet this new, integrated version of the empath. They recognized, often with a profound sense of humility, that they had indeed been taking undue advantage of an extraordinary human being, and they consciously chose to evolve, to become truly worthy of such a person. These relationships, against all odds, blossomed and transformed into something far healthier, more balanced, and deeply rooted in mutual respect, rather than built upon the unstable foundation of one-sided emotional labor and endless sacrifice. Other partners, however, simply could not adapt to this new reality. They desperately missed the old version of the empath, the one who effortlessly absorbed their dysfunction, diligently managed their emotions, and asked for absolutely nothing in return. When they attempted their familiar manipulation tactics and found them utterly ineffective, they often chose to leave, embarking on a search for a new, unsuspecting empath to exploit. And the awakened empath, now fortified by inner strength, let them go without the usual searing pain, recognizing the departure not as a crushing loss, but as a protective act, a necessary step towards their own liberation. Jung keenly observed that this profound indifference, this emotional detachment, often provoked a sense of genuine panic within the empath's social circle. This wasn't because the empath had suddenly become mean-spirited or vindictive. Rather, it was because their strategic withdrawal, their very absence, starkly revealed the immense amount of underlying dysfunction they had for so long been silently concealing and holding together. Family systems that had appeared outwardly functional suddenly began to unravel and fall apart, without the empath's invisible emotional glue. Friendships that had seemed deep and enduring revealed themselves to be fundamentally parasitic, sustained only by the empath's tireless giving. Workplaces that had run smoothly descended into chaos without the empath's unseen emotional labor, their ability to navigate and mitigate interpersonal tensions. The people who had so freely benefited from the empath's unconscious servitude suddenly and painfully, understood the profound extent of what they had truly lost. But by then, the awakened empath had moved far beyond caring about their belated realization. This was not an act of revenge. This was an ultimate declaration of sovereignty. The empath had, at long last, learned the invaluable lesson that their extraordinary gift was not meant to be indiscriminately given to everyone, but rather to be fiercely protected, carefully guarded, and consciously shared only with those who truly valued it, who reciprocated that value. Jung referred to this powerful state as psychologically invincible, not because nothing could ever hurt the empath again, for they remained sensitive beings, but because they had finally integrated their vast capacity to feel everything with the profound wisdom to consciously choose their responses. They could still acutely sense the pain of others, instantly read emotional atmospheres, and perceive unspoken truths with piercing clarity. But these powerful perceptions no longer held them captive. They no longer controlled their actions or dictated their emotional state. They had, through arduous self-work, become the conscious, empowered director of their own empathy, rather than its unconscious, exploited slave. This is precisely where Jung's groundbreaking research unveiled something simultaneously beautiful and, to the uninitiated, terrifying. These awakened empaths developed extraordinary abilities that rendered them almost impossible to manipulate. They could unerringly identify narcissists within mere minutes of meeting them, recognizing the subtle tells, the underlying patterns. They instantly recognized the insidious tactics of love bombing, the deceptive allure of future faking, and the disorienting effects of gaslighting, long before these manipulative strategies could even take root or exert their damaging influence. They sensed inauthentic, draining energy with an almost superhuman accuracy, and simply chose not to engage with it, effortlessly sidestepping traps. Their integrated consciousness functioned as an automatic, highly sophisticated early warning system that protected them without conscious effort. Yet crucially, they did not wield these formidable abilities destructively. They possessed the psychological insight and the intimate knowledge to potentially weaponize their understanding, to dismantle and utterly destroy everyone who had ever caused them pain. They held within them an almost encyclopedic knowledge of others' deepest vulnerabilities, their most profound fears, and their most glaring weaknesses. Yet, with a quiet strength that defied conventional expectations, they consciously chose not to retaliate, not to seek vengeance. Instead, they simply, gracefully removed toxic people from their lives and steadily moved forward, their gaze fixed on their own growth and peace. This remarkable restraint stemmed not from a place of weakness or fear, but from a genuine, profound disinterest in the petty games of revenge. Jung was, in a way, disturbed by this profound restraint, not because he wished them to seek vengeance, but because he keenly recognized the immense power they now possessed and the extraordinary ethical choice they were making not to abuse it. These empaths had, in essence, become psychological masters, individuals who understood the intricate nuances of human nature at levels most people never even begin to approach. They absolutely could manipulate, control, and devastate if they chose to exercise that power. Instead, they chose to wield their newfound strength and insight to meticulously protect their own sacred peace and to genuinely help those others who were truly ready, truly willing, and deeply committed to their own growth and healing. This highly selective and intentional application of their unique gifts created what Jung so aptly termed the empath's mirror effect. Their mere presence, without a single word being spoken, made inauthentic people profoundly uncomfortable. Manipulators instantly felt exposed, stripped bare of their pretense. Energy vampires, sensing that they could no longer feed their insatiable hunger, quickly and instinctively moved on to easier, less fortified targets. Meanwhile, authentic, genuine people, those whose intentions were pure, felt a sense of profound safety and ease around the awakened empath for the very first time. They recognized someone who saw them clearly, truly, without judgment, someone with whom they could genuinely connect. The awakened empath, in essence, became a living, breathing filter. Their integrated consciousness automatically repelled dysfunction, like a magnet pushing away opposing poles, and effortlessly attracted growth, drawing kindred spirits closer. They no longer had to actively, consciously vet people or perform endless due diligence. Their integrated, authentic presence did it naturally, organically. Those who simply could not handle their newfound clarity and unwavering authenticity instinctively removed themselves from the empath's orbit. Those who deeply valued genuine, authentic connection moved closer, drawn by the empath's radiant truth. The empath's entire social circle transformed completely, without any deliberate, conscious effort on their part. Jung meticulously documented how these awakened empaths systematically rebuilt their lives upon entirely new, infinitely healthier foundations. They consciously chose careers that profoundly honored their innate sensitivity, rather than mercilessly exploiting it. Some transitioned into becoming highly effective therapists, capable of holding immense space for their clients without absorbing their pain and suffering. Others channeled their acute perception and deep emotional understanding into various forms of artistic creation, producing works of profound beauty and insight. Many sought out work environments that offered solitude and a high degree of autonomy, meticulously protecting their precious energy from constant depletion and emotional drain. They carefully cultivated friend groups based on genuine reciprocity, mutual respect, and shared growth, rather than the old, exhausting dynamics of constant rescue and unilateral support. Every single relationship in their lives became a conscious, deliberate choice, rather than a burdensome, unconscious obligation. They entered romantic relationships as whole, self-sufficient individuals, rather than as desperate fixers or self-sacrificing saviors. They consciously chose partners who valued their inner peace as deeply as they themselves did. Partners who understood implicitly that genuine love does not, and should not, require suffering or endless self-abandonment. Everything in their existence transformed because they had, at long last, learned to value themselves with the same fierce devotion, the same unwavering respect that they had once so freely bestowed upon others. Their homes, once open hospitals for every wounded soul, became sacred sanctuaries of peace and restoration. Their time, once infinitely available to every demand, became precious and highly guarded. Their energy, once carelessly distributed to all who sought it, became sacred, consciously directed, and deeply revered. They finally understood, with profound clarity, that protecting their inner peace was not an act of selfishness. It was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity for their very survival, and indeed, essential for their truly authentic and impactful contribution to the wider world. This, then, is the transformative moment, the act of stopping caring about others' dysfunction ultimately became the moment of finally, truly caring for their own precious soul. This was the ultimate act of self-love, not narcissism or egoistic selfishness, but the profound recognition that their powerful empathy was an extraordinary gift that deserved unwavering protection, firm boundaries, and conscious, intentional direction. They had finally internalized the profound wisdom that Jung had tirelessly sought to impart to all his patients. You simply cannot pour from an empty cup, and martyrdom, however noble it may seem, ultimately serves no one, neither the giver nor the receiver. Jung understood this monumental transformation as the birth of a truly sovereign individual, someone who had courageously navigated the treacherous waters of unconscious empathy, endured the searing pain of profound betrayal and personal breaking, moved through the arduous process of shadow integration, and ultimately emerged as a conscious, empowered chooser of their own reality. They no longer reacted impulsively to the emotional demands of others. Instead, they responded thoughtfully and intentionally from a deep, unwavering place of integrated wholeness. Every single action they took became intentional, deliberate, and purposeful, rather than merely reactive. The empath who stops caring, therefore, has not, in any way, lost their humanity. On the contrary, they have, for the first time, truly found their inherent power. They have not become cold or unfeeling. They have become conscious, acutely aware, and deeply discerning. They have not stopped loving. They have, in fact, learned to love themselves with the same fierce devotion, the same boundless compassion they once gave away indiscriminately to the entire world. This profound evolution represents the highest form of psychological development that Jung meticulously identified in his vast and groundbreaking body of work. This is precisely why Jung termed it the final stage of spiritual awakening. Not because there is no further room left for growth or evolution, but because the empath has, at long last, integrated the most fundamental and vital lesson of all. Their sensitivity is sacred. Their energy is invaluable. Their inner peace is absolutely non-negotiable. And anyone who cannot or will not respect these immutable truths simply has no place in their newly curated, authentic life. This is not cruelty. This is the purest, most unadulterated form of clarity. The awakened empath becomes precisely what society desperately needs, yet so rarely truly deserves. Someone who can feel profoundly and deeply without ever losing themselves in the process. Someone who can love powerfully and authentically without inadvertently enabling dysfunction or destructive patterns. Someone who can see the world with crystal clarity without succumbing to the corrosive cynicism that often accompanies such insight. They embody love with healthy boundaries, compassion infused with profound wisdom, kindness tempered by unwavering strength, and empathy guided by an unshakable sovereignty. This transformation is not a loss. It is, in every conceivable way, a magnificent victory. Not a victory over others, but a glorious triumph over the pervasive conditioning that relentlessly taught empaths that their inherent worth was inextricably tied to how much they could tirelessly sacrifice. The empath who finally stops caring about maintaining a superficial peace in toxic systems has at long last truly begun to care deeply about cultivating an authentic, unwavering peace within their own precious soul. They have courageously rejected the false, insidious narrative that goodness inherently requires suffering, and that true love inexorably demands self-abandonment. The moment the empath stops caring is not the end of their story. It is, unequivocally, the triumphant beginning of their sovereignty, and that truly is exactly what the world needs more of. Not empaths who sacrifice themselves endlessly, but empaths who have bravely learned to wield their extraordinary gifts consciously, powerfully, and with profound selectivity. Welcome to your awakening. You have truly earned this magnificent transformation through every single moment you suffered in silent endurance. And now, at long last, you are finally and gloriously free.